Mosaic, a daily news program from Link TV, presents a selection of news reports from independent and state-controlled broadcasters from throughout the Middle East.
Welcome. France says that its national airline company, Air France, cancelled 3 flights from Paris to the United States for security reasons. The French Interior Minister said that the flights were cancelled at the request of the U.S. Embassy in Paris. The United States raised the security alert level just before Christmas, subjecting foreign airlines to stricter security measures. Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak and Syrian President Bashar al-Assad both called for the Middle East to be free of weapons of mass destruction. In a statement made at the end of a summit in Egypt's Sharm el-Sheikh, the two presidents called on Israel to abandon all its weapons of mass destruction. During the summit, Syria confirmed its desire to resume negotiations with Israel from the point where they left off 3 years ago. Today, Abu Dhabi TV has learned that Saab Arakat and Shimon Peres held a meeting in Ramallah. Meanwhile, the Palestinian Authority today postponed scheduled Palestinian-Israeli meetings until next week, in protest of Israeli aggressions targeting Rafah in southern Gaza, killing 10 Palestinians and wounding at least 40 others. The meeting included senior Palestinian negotiator Saab Arakat and Dov Weisglass, Chief of Staff to Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, discussing continued preparations for a meeting between Sharon and Palestinian Prime Minister Ahmed Kureya. The Israeli army entered into Nablus, in the center of the West Bank, demolishing homes in search for so-called wanted Palestinians. The Palestinians responded by throwing stones at the Israelis. The Israeli army countered with tear gas and rubber bullets. The Israeli army imposed a curfew for the 10th consecutive day on the Balata refugee camp east of Nablus. Meanwhile, Palestinians in Rafah mourn 10 martyrs who were killed in Israeli raids in the area of Yibna and Qasas. The security situation in Iraqi cities continues to deteriorate. A U.S. Army spokesman announced today that 3 soldiers were killed near Samarra. Meanwhile, a car bomb exploded near the Interior Ministry building in the city of Arbil, killing 5 people and wounding about 100 others. In addition, an explosive device blew up a civilian vehicle in the area of Nafaq al-Shurta, west of Baghdad, killing 1 person and wounding 2 others. An Iraqi policeman was also killed in Mosul. These attacks come after a large U.S. military operation in southern Baghdad.
A car bomb exploded near the Interior Ministry building in the northern Iraqi city of Arbil, killing 4 people, including 2 policemen, a civilian, and the bomber himself. In addition, 15 people were wounded, many of them are ministry employees. This is the 3rd attack in Arbil in a period of 3 months. The strength of the explosion shattered windows of the neighboring buildings. The U.S. Army lifted part of the media restrictions it imposed following a night-long military operation in southern Baghdad. However, in the morning, the destruction caused by the American operation and the confrontations that took place was visible. The clashes between the U.S. soldiers and the Iraqi fighters were the most violent in recent months. The U.S. Army refused to go into the details of this late-night operation, but the U.S. forces used warplanes and tanks against targets they claimed belonged to the armed groups attacking their troops in southern Baghdad.
We conduct operations to maintain security in the Rashid neighborhood in Baghdad. What we did last night is part of a greater continued operation to ensure that this area won't be a safe haven for members of the previous regime, extremists, and groups attacking us.
During the operation, the U.S. forces conducted an arrest campaign, detaining people suspected of attacking the coalition forces. The U.S. believes that after the capture of the former Iraqi president, Saddam Hussein, the U.S. forces may be able to contain the attacks against them. The U.S. Army added that 50 members of the former regime were arrested on Monday, adding that due to the arrest of Saddam Hussein, they were able to gather information on the infrastructure of the armed groups.
The same phenomena that happened after the killing of Saddam Hussein's sons is happening again.
U.S. Army commanders say that prior to Saddam Hussein's capture, it was believed that about 8 to 10 armed cells were operating in Baghdad. Thanks to the information that they received, they are sure that there are 14 armed cells.
We arrested 9 cell leaders this week, and we are pursuing about 10 to 12 others. There are 4 families in this building that belongs to Sheikh Ghazi al-Hanash. The American soldiers raided the building, blowing up doors, arresting my dad, Sheikh Ghazi, and his son.
The U.S. commanders added that in the past 2 days they arrested more than 70 people in various Iraqi cities, including a tribal leader who was close to the former Vice President Izzat Ibrahim al-Duri, adding that they arrested a number of people suspected of attacking U.S. forces.
The Washington Post reported Wednesday that U.S. President George W. Bush's consultative committee concluded it had proposed a dubious claim when it accused Iraq in Bush's State of the Union address of seeking to buy uranium in an effort to make nuclear weapons. British officials, meanwhile, are saying that former Iraqi President Saddam Hussein may have been duped into believing that Iraq did possess weapons of mass destruction. According to the London-based Guardian Daily, this theory is a result of an attempt to find what one source called a logical reason why no chemical biological weapons have been found in Iraq. British government officials say that this explains why the intelligence gleaned by their Secret Service agents was also wrong. A spokesman for Iraqi Governing Council member Ahmed al-Shalabi said on Tuesday that Jordan was harboring remnants of Saddam Hussein's regime. Intifada Qambar accused Saddam's daughter Raghad, who is living in Amman, is operating against the Iraqi people and using money taken from Iraq during her father's rule. He also accused Jordan of sheltering relatives of those on the list of the 52 wanted from Saddam's regime.
The Jordanian government unfortunately neglected the quest of the Iraqi people to get those suspects and criminals back to Iraq, and in fact it gave them a place where they are functioning from, and they are conspiring against the new Iraq and the governing council. Among those people, most known as Raghad, the daughter of Saddam Hussein. There are also many other figures, such as the son of Tariq Aziz Ziad and the sons and daughters of many other figures who were even part of the 52 members, the top members to be arrested.
Israel's defense ministry said that by the end of year 2004, Israel will have completed the main tranche of its separation wall that cuts through the West Bank and would wrap up the project in the following year. Around 520 kilometers out of the planned 728 kilometers will have been completed. The Ma'arif Daily reported Wednesday that Israel was to deploy hundreds of bulldozers in the coming days to speed up construction of the barrier ahead of a ruling by the International Court of Justice on its legality. The paper said the aim of the operation was to establish facts on the ground ahead of the ruling. A Qassam rocket hit Stedrod settlement in lands occupied since 1948 near the Gaza Strip early Wednesday, but there were no casualties. On Tuesday evening, a similar rocket had wounded a couple of settlers in Nisanid settlement at the Gaza Strip. The Islamic Jihad had explicitly warned of retaliation after 9 Palestinians were killed in an Israeli raid on Rafah refugee camp in the southern Gaza Strip. Now, Christmas in Bethlehem in occupied Palestine is overshadowed by the Israeli aggressions against Palestinians, and tourists are staying away from the city. Bethlehem Mayor Hanna Nasser blames occupied Israeli military roadblocks around Bethlehem for the rarity of tourists and the town's dire economic troubles.
There have been so few tourists visiting Bethlehem in occupied Palestine since the Intifada began in September 2000. 3 years of fighting, including gun battles in the center of the town, Israeli army raids and standoff last year between Palestinians holed up in the Nativity Church and occupied Israeli forces who besieged them, have taken a toll. 2 days before Christmas, not a soul stood by the Byzantine-era Church of the Nativity except for 2 guards and a monk hanging incense burners. Bethlehem Mayor Hanna Nasser blames Israeli military roadblocks around Bethlehem for a rarity of tourists and the town's dire economic troubles.
We don't have free movement, we don't have joy because of the consequences of the Israeli incursions last year, and we are still paying the price from these incursions. You know, it's not easy to leave the city, it's not easy to get into the city. Tourists are not here coming, and Bethlehem depends on tourism. 70% of the economy of the city comes from tourism. The unemployment is 60%. The income per capita has dropped from being $2,400 to less than $400. All this really has affected very deeply the economy of the city.
Meanwhile, Palestinians dressed up as Mary and Joseph tried to enter Bethlehem. A woman riding a donkey and a man leading her approached an Israeli checkpoint to protest against the restrictions on free movement for Palestinians, making it virtually impossible for them to celebrate Christmas. Soldiers at the checkpoint turned them away. Palestinian President Yasser Arafat is still under siege in his Ramallah headquarters and will yet again be prohibited from making the trip to Bethlehem for Christmas for the 3rd consecutive year. The Latin Patriarch Michel Sabah came to visit him in his office, and Arafat said he hoped that the situation would be better next year.
Israeli occupation forces started reconstructing a fence at the southern Lebanese borders close to Al-Ghajar village. The 35-year-old fence was left abandoned after the Israeli military withdrawal in 2000. The construction work started after the latest storm caused some damage to the rusty fence, which prompted fast reconstruction work. Israel fears that leaving the fence unrepaired would make it easier for Hezbollah resistance fighters to infiltrate and capture more Israeli troops.
Israel launched a scheme for reconstructing a bordering fence at the eastern bank of the Wazani River across the Ghajar village on the Palestinian-Lebanese borders. Since the border delineation process finished in 2000, the year the Israeli occupation forces withdrew from southern Lebanon, Israel did not lay a finger on that fence. But now a unit of the Israeli Occupation Logistic Brigade launched the reconstruction scheme. The fence had been constructed since 35 years ago when the Israeli forces occupied the Syrian Golan Heights. The forces have been reluctant for the past 3 years to come across the border, fearing that Hezbollah resistance fighters would ambush troops there. But the latest storm had caused landslides that damaged the fence, a move that forced the occupation forces to do some reparations. A huge reinforcement unit escorted Israeli bulldozers. Military vehicles and forces were stretched several hundred meters on the outskirts of Ghajar village across the Wazani banks. This new Israeli procedure came after Israel threatened Wazani residents via the international peacekeeping forces that its forces would open fire without prior warning on anyone crossing the eastern bank of the river. The peacekeeping forces in turn intensified its patrols in the region and took up makeshift positions, especially that the occupation forces are functioning in an unsecured area. These new measures were only imposed after Israeli occupation forces killed 2 Lebanese civilians 2 weeks ago in a nearby area. A Lebanese military team tasked with surveillance is also following up the construction work. The Lebanese team conducted a topographic survey based on the available maps. The head of the team refused to comment on the steps taken, but Manar knew that the team will keep up the surveillance work on a daily basis for fear of any Israeli violations of Lebanese territory, mainly because the construction work is taking place close to the Blue Line.
Palestinians mourned the killing of 9 Palestinians in the Gaza Strip by Israeli troops yesterday. 5 Palestinians were wounded by Israeli fire in the West Bank. Palestinian sources said Israeli soldiers opened fire on people taking part in a march against the Israeli occupation in the West Bank city of Nablus, wounding 5 youths in Gaza Strip. Israeli armored columns trundled out of Rafah refugee camp after carrying out the fiercest raid on the battered camp yesterday, killing 9 Palestinians and wounding dozens others. Dozens of families in the camp, home to thousands of Palestinian refugees, found themselves dispossessed once more by Israeli bulldozers that reduced rows of shanties to rubble in the 24-hour raid. An Israeli military spokeswoman claimed that troops have demolished a 3-story building found to be concealing a tunnel used to smuggle arms and fuel a 3-year-old Palestinian uprising. Mourners marched through the streets of the camp waving flags from various Palestinian factions. They chanted angrily as they carried the bodies of those killed in yesterday's raid and vowed revenge. Japanese Prime Minister Junichiro Koizumi told his self-defense force personnel on the route to Iraq that Iraq can't be a safe place and that their mission is difficult and dangerous. Koizumi was speaking to his troops in a special ceremony before heading to Iraq to help with the reconstruction of the country. The first party of Air Force troops may depart for bases in Kuwait and Qatar as soon as Friday, in the opening stage of what is likely to be the country's biggest and most dangerous overseas mission in more than half a century. The remainder of the contingent of up to 1,000 air, sea, and ground troops are expected to leave in dribs and drabs over the next 3 months. Outside Kumaki Air Base, more than 100 left-wing and peace activists carrying banners and shouting slogans gathered to protest against Japan's plan to send troops to Iraq. Riot police soon surrounded the protesters.
In the American capital of Washington, a senior United States official described the speech of Prime Minister Ariel Sharon as a very positive development that may facilitate the peace negotiations on the piece of the roadmap plan. He denied reports claiming that the United States administration is not satisfied with Sharon's speech, saying they are based on misinterpretation to what the White House spokesman said. The senior United States official also added that the White House is not opposed to unilateral steps if they help achieve the roadmap for peace between Israel and the Palestinians. Scott McLennan, the White House spokesman, said that he was satisfied with the Israeli Prime Minister's commitment to the roadmap plan.
Any Israeli effort to impose a settlement, unilateral steps, can help the roadmap move forward if they are part of the roadmap and steps under the roadmap, or they can block the roadmap. It depends on what they are. And Israeli action to remove unauthorized outposts or to remove isolated settlements are consistent with the roadmap.
In the Chinese capital of Beijing, the Israeli President Moshe Katsav commented on the speech of Ariel Sharon, saying that Israel is committed to the roadmap plan. In a press conference, he emphasized that Israel will not allow the bloodshed to continue calling on the Palestinian Authority to stop the violence immediately. President Moshe Katsav met with his Chinese counterpart Ho Jianitao and Prime Minister Wen Jiabao. In the last day of the visit, President Katsav and the Chinese Deputy Prime Minister opened the new Israeli embassy in Beijing.
Prime Minister last night said that we cannot wait forever. We must do something for preventing the continuity of bloodshed against us. We are calling to Palestinian leadership to stop the violence immediately, renew the peace talks immediately, and start to implement the roadmap immediately. Tomorrow morning, tonight, now. My desire for the new year is that those positive voices which I have heard among the Palestinian leadership, Palestinian people, will not be few and low voices, that such a positive voices will be raised and will be open and will call to the Palestinian people to stop their violence.
Shimon Peres, the leader of the Israeli Labor Party, said that Prime Minister Ariel Sharon must be committed to the roadmap, adding that the Palestinian leadership must stop terrorism, or else it will be labeled as an authority that supports terrorism. He met with the foreign ambassadors in Israel in the wake of Ariel Sharon's speech in Herzliya.
Because if they will not put an end to terror, and they will be perceived as a state in being by the chaotic approach of terrorism, they may be marked as belonging to the camp of terror. And today the world is divided not so much between East and West or North and South, but between terror and terrorism, a division which will become more and more important and powerful, because the war against terror, is the war by the terrorists, is at the beginning, unfortunately, not at the end. On the other hand, you cannot say, I shall disengage from the Palestinians, without thinking if the Palestinians will disengage from us. I do not believe in a unilateral disengagement when you are living almost door by door, body to body. What will happen? If disengagement would be a solution, we could have done it a long time ago.
President Hosni Mubarak and his Syrian counterpart Bashar al-Assad held a one-day summit in the Egyptian Red Sea resort of Sharm el-Sheikh on Wednesday. Now TV's Nihal Saad has the details on the two leaders' talks.
A crucial summit took place at the Red Sea resort of Sharm el-Sheikh on Wednesday between President Hosni Mubarak and Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. Jump-starting the Syrian track and the U.S. pressure on Syria figured prominently in the two leaders' talks, which began immediately on the bilateral level at the airport. President Mubarak had earlier called on U.S. President George W. Bush to reinvigorate the Syrian-Israeli negotiations. At the same time, the Syrian president had stated his country's willingness to resume such negotiations. Israeli Foreign Minister Silvan Shalom told reporters in a joint press conference with Egypt's Foreign Minister Ahmed Maher last Monday in Jerusalem that Israel is willing to restart negotiations with Damascus without preconditions. The two leaders, who resumed their talks in an expanded meeting that included the two countries' delegations, discussed Syria's Accountability Act signed by President Bush earlier this month. Cairo holds the view that the U.S. president will not use the bill. Concluding their talks, the two presidents decided to preside over a joint hire committee with the task of discussing strategic and regional issues. The two Arab leaders reiterated their call for the need to rid the Middle East region of weapons of mass destruction, including Israel, within the framework of the UN resolutions. Nihal Saad, Manar TV International, Sharm el-Sheikh.
Iranian Defense Minister Ali Shamkhani warned on Wednesday that the Islamic regime would use all means at its disposal if Israel struck its nuclear facilities. He noted that Iran will use all strike weapons at its disposal, and the Shahab-3 missile in one of those. Shamkhani was speaking after a cabinet meeting in response to questions on whether Iran would retaliate if Israel made good its threats to attack Iranian nuclear sites. The Tel Aviv Daily Haaretz Sunday quoted Israeli Defense Minister Shaul Mofaz as warning that the Jewish state was considering striking the nuclear facilities of Iran, despite an agreement earlier this month to submit them to snap UN inspection.
In their annual report on the situation of the children throughout the world, the UN Children's Fund revealed that 120 million children do not go to school, limiting their opportunities of a good life and making them the most likely to live in poverty. A report by Soraya Farsi.
How do we make the right to education the mainstream and equal for both girls and boys, erasing the reality of the current imbalance and disparities? Nearly 121 million school-aged children in the world are uneducated and do not attend schools, and from them 65 million are girls. The grim situation was reported in the UN Children's Fund's annual report. The report calls for exerting more efforts and utilizing all resources for political and financial support by governments and international institutions committed to removing limitations on education to children and the disparity between the genders. According to the UNICEF report, the greatest disparity between boys and girls' school attendance is among different economically developed countries. In industrialized countries, 96% of boys and 97% of girls are educated. Meanwhile, only 62% of boys and 57% of girls are educated in the southern Sahara countries. UNICEF called for launching a massive campaign targeted towards strengthening efforts to increase, as much as possible, the number of girls in schools by the year 2005. These efforts are the best investment to combat illiteracy, poverty and disease, and to move forward with sustainable development and equality.
In sports news, the Kuwaiti Soccer Union announced that it supports Morocco's bid for competition to host the World Cup in 2010. It was announced by Sheikh Ahmed Youssef Sabah, who headed the first meeting of the union, saying he will mobilize efforts to ensure Morocco's success in the 2010 championship bid. Also, France, Spain, Saudi Arabia, and the Emirates officially support Morocco's bid. 5 African states are competing for the bid. They are Egypt, South Africa, Tunisia, Libya, and Morocco, for the first championship to be held on the African continent.
Mosaic is made possible by a grant from the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, which promotes journalism excellence worldwide and invests in the vitality of 26 U.S. communities, and the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. Additional support is provided by the Firedoll Foundation and Henry and Virgilia Dakin.